Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and imagine Britain at the turn of the 5th century. The great roads of Rome still cut across the land, long, straight lines of stone bordered by weeds and moss. Abandoned fortresses, once garrisoned by disciplined Roman soldiers, stand half-empty, their walls eroded by wind and rain. Market towns that once bustled with Latin voices grow quieter, their people reverting to older, local ways. You are standing at the threshold of what historians call the Dark Ages, a phrase less about literal darkness and more about silence. The silence of lost records, the silence of voices no longer written down. What happened to Britain after the Romans left? Who took power? Who survived? And who faded into obscurity? This is the beginning of that long and shadowed story. The Roman departure. By the year 410, the Roman administration of Britain had collapsed. For nearly 3 centuries, Rome had ruled here, shaping life in ways that even the poorest farmer would notice. Roads connected villages, coins circulated widely, soldiers kept order, governors dispatched reports to emperors far away. But the Roman Empire itself was crumbling. Invasions across the Rhine and Danube drew troops away from the provinces. Communication faltered. And when the Romano-British elite petitioned the Emperor Honorius for help, they were told to look to their own defenses. In practical terms, Britain was abandoned. Imagine the effect of this slow withdrawal. Villas once warmed by hypocausts grew cold. Bathhouses became ruins. Town councils left without Roman oversight struggled to collect taxes or organize defenses. A generation grew up that no longer remembered Rome as a presence, but only as a fading memory. Life without Rome. For most people, life had always been local. The peasant farmer still awoke with the dawn, tended to his sheep or cattle, and scratched the earth for barley and oats. But the absence of Roman order meant vulnerability. Pirates from Ireland raided the western coasts. Saxon seafarers appeared in the east. Picts descended from the north. Small communities fortified themselves, digging ditches around hilltops or retreating into woodland. The memory of Roman roads remained, but many were left to crumble, while local tracks and muddy lanes became the new lifelines. You might imagine a family in a wooden roundhouse, smoke from a central fire curling up through the thatch. Tools were crude but effective: iron sickles, wooden plows, clay pots. Coins were hoarded, sometimes buried in pots and never retrieved. People survived through barter, kinship ties, and loyalty to local chieftains. The sense of living in a world after greatness must have weighed heavily. Roman mosaics cracked beneath weeds, statues toppled, fields that once supplied garrisons grew wild again. The local rulers. In this vacuum, power fragmented. Local rulers, some Romanized Britons, others more traditionally Celtic, sought to hold authority. Names like Vortigern appear in later records, half historical, half legendary. He is described as a leader who invited Saxon mercenaries to help fend off raids, a decision that would have consequences for centuries. But leadership was fragile. Without the Roman army to enforce order, politics became intensely local. A chief who protected his people and distributed food earned loyalty. One who failed could be overthrown or ignored. Archaeology tells part of the story. Hill forts, once abandoned during Roman peace, were reoccupied. Churches in some towns remained active, suggesting that Christianity survived in pockets. At the same time, older pagan practices may have quietly returned in villages far from bishops and priests. Christianity in transition. Religion was one of the few Roman legacies to endure. Christianity had spread across Britain in the 3rd and 4th centuries, and bishops had even attended councils on the continent. But without Roman infrastructure, churches struggled. Some Christian communities survived in towns like St. Albans, where shrines were maintained. Others faded, and older beliefs resurfaced in the countryside. Imagine a small church of stone, its roof leaking, its congregation small. Candles burn faintly, and the Latin hymns are sung more from memory than understanding. Meanwhile, in a neighboring valley, villagers gather around a sacred spring, leaving offerings as their ancestors once did. Faith, like politics, fragmented into local forms. Christianity would later return in strength through Irish and continental missionaries. But in these early decades, it was a fragile and uncertain presence. Daily life in the shadow of collapse. What did ordinary life feel like in this shifting landscape? Archaeology again helps us. Settlements shrank in size. Pottery became simpler, often handmade rather than imported. Trade diminished. Diet was modest. Cereals like barley and oats, supplemented with beans, peas, and root vegetables. Meat was occasional, often pork or mutton, with cattle reserved for wealthier households. Ale brewed from barley provided daily drink. Homes were wooden, smoke-filled, with floors of packed earth. Families lived closely together, with livestock often kept indoors during winter. Work was constant, tending fields, spinning wool, repairing tools. Leisure, if it existed, might come in the form of storytelling around a fire, recalling both Roman memories and older Celtic myths. The contrast between what had been, paved towns, heated villas, imported wine, and what now was, mud, wood, local barley ale, must have been stark. Yet for those who had never known Rome, this was simply life. The Saxon arrival. As the decades passed, outside groups began to shape Britain's destiny. Saxons, Angles, and Jutes from across the North Sea were first hired as mercenaries, but soon came as settlers. Archaeology shows new burial styles, ship burials, cremation urns, and grave goods like brooches and swords. To some Britons, these newcomers were a threat. To others, they were allies against raiders. But their presence grew, and with it came cultural change. Place names in eastern England shifted from Celtic or Latin to Old English. Fields were divided differently. Languages mingled. This was no single invasion, but a slow seepage. Families arriving, settlements forming, alliances shifting. Yet the result was profound. Britain was becoming a mosaic of cultures, identities, and rivalries. The sense of loss. Later writers, centuries after, would speak of this time as one of loss. Gildas, a 5th-century monk, described Britain as a land of ruin, plagued by sin and invaded by barbarians. His account is moralizing, but it reflects the memory of collapse, the sense that something once ordered and great had been lost, leaving chaos in its place. But was it truly chaos? For the people who lived it, life continued. Children were born, crops were sown, marriages arranged. The rhythms of life persisted, even if the framework of empire had crumbled. But the silence of records means much is unknown. This is why historians call it the Dark Ages, not because the people themselves lived in darkness, but because the light of written evidence is so dim. And so Britain at the dawn of the Dark Ages was a land of fragments. Roman walls crumbled while local chiefs rose. Christianity flickered while older traditions revived. Farmers dug their fields, unaware that their grandchildren would live in a land utterly transformed by Saxons and Angles. But what happened when the Saxons gained power? How did small communities become kingdoms? And what role did legendary figures like Arthur, half history, half myth, play in the story?
When the Roman world collapsed, Britain stood vulnerable. Along its coasts, ships from the continent began to appear more frequently. Some came as raiders, others as settlers. These were the Saxons, Angles, and Jutes, peoples of northern Europe skilled in seafaring, farming, and war. Imagine standing on a beach in eastern Britain in the early 5th century. The tide is low, and the wet sand gleams in the pale light. On the horizon, faint shapes grow larger, long wooden boats, their prows carved with simple designs, their sails patched and heavy. Within them sit men, women, and children, bundled together with tools, animals, and bundles of grain. They are not merely raiders, they are migrants, searching for land. To the local Britons, these arrivals were both familiar and alien. They spoke Germanic tongues, incomprehensible to the Latinized or Celtic-speaking islanders. Their clothing was simpler, their customs strange. Yet they brought strength, discipline, and skill in fighting, qualities the desperate British rulers thought they could use. Vortigern and the Invitation. Later chronicles tell us of a leader named Vortigern, a Romano-British chief, who, facing raids from Picts and Irish, invited Saxon warriors to settle in Britain as mercenaries. The story goes that two brothers, Hengist and Horsa, led these Saxons. At first they fought loyally for their host, but soon they demanded more land, more food, and more power. Was this tale true? Perhaps only in part. Archaeology supports the idea that Germanic groups were first invited, then grew in number until they were difficult to control. What matters is that by the mid-5th century, Saxon presence in Britain was undeniable. Their settlements clustered along the east and south coasts, Kent, East Anglia, the Thames Valley. From there they pushed inland, often at the expense of local Britons. Archaeological footprints. The story of the Saxon settlement is written in graves as much as in texts. Across eastern England, archaeologists have uncovered burial sites filled with distinct dramatic artifacts. Cremation urns, decorated with simple geometric designs. Brooches, shaped like discs or safety pins. Beads of amber and glass. Swords laid beside warriors, knives beside farmers. These burials tell us about identity. To be buried with such goods marked one as part of the Saxon world. Over time, Britons themselves adopted similar customs, blurring the line between invader and native. The settlements were modest, clusters of wooden halls surrounded by fields. No villas, no stone forums, instead long houses with thatched roofs, hearths at the center, smoke curling through rafters. Livestock roamed nearby, and fields stretched beyond. The struggle for land. For the Britons, this was a slow disaster. Some fought back, as later stories of heroic resistance suggest. Others may have fled westward, into Wales and Cornwall, where Romanized culture lingered longer. Still others may have intermarried with the newcomers, gradually blending into the Saxon world. The landscape of Britain itself shifted. Old Roman towns like Londinium and Verulamium shrank to near nothing, their ruins haunted by weeds and owls. New Saxon villages rose elsewhere, often ignoring the Roman grid. Fields were divided in strips, farming carried out communally by extended families. Power was local. A chieftain might rule a cluster of villages, offering protection in return for loyalty. These leaders, strong in war and generous in peace, laid the foundations for the future Saxon kingdoms. Yet the story was not of one simple conquest. In the West, Britons held firm. The Welsh bardic tradition preserves poems of resistance, lamenting loss but also celebrating defiance. Figures like Ambrosius Aurelianus, perhaps a Romano-British general, are remembered as leaders who fought against Saxon advance. It is in this landscape of resistance that the legend of Arthur begins to take shape. Whether Arthur was real, myth, or a blend of many war leaders, his memory speaks of a time when Britons pushed back. Battles were fought, victories won, though the tide, in the long run, flowed against them. So, in these early decades, Britain was not yet Saxon, nor fully Britain. It was a contested land. Settlements rose, ruins crumbled, alliances shifted. The Saxons brought new customs and ways of life, but they were not yet kings of all. The question remains, how did these scattered settlements and fragile alliances become organized kingdoms? Kent, Sussex, Wessex, and beyond. What was daily life like in these new societies, and how did they transform Britain's cultural fabric?
The Saxon migrants who first set foot on Britain's eastern shores came in family groups, bringing with them not only warriors, but women, children, and elders. Unlike the legions of Rome, these were not professional soldiers bound by empire, but settlers who lived by their own strength. Their social structure was simple but effective, rooted in kinship and loyalty. At the base of society was the ceorl, the free peasant farmer. He owned little more than his tools, his house, and perhaps a strip of land to cultivate. Yet his freedom gave him value. He owed service to his lord, but he was not a slave. He could bear arms, join the war band, and share in the spoils of raids. Above him stood the thane, a noble warrior, bound to a lord through loyalty. Thanes gathered around a chieftain, forming his household retinue. They ate at his table, received gifts of rings and weapons, and defended his honor in battle. At the top, the sinning, the king. In these early years, a king's authority stretched no further than his ability to command men and distribute wealth. His throne was not a gilded seat in a stone hall, but a wooden chair in a smoky longhouse where warriors gathered by firelight. Beneath them all were the thralls, the unfree. These were captives taken in raids or debtors who had lost their freedom. They worked the fields, tended the livestock, and served in silence. The longhouse. Picture the heart of a Saxon village, the longhouse. Built of timber, with walls of wattle and daub, its roof thatched with straw, the longhouse was both dwelling and gathering place. A central hearth burned low, smoke rising through gaps in the rafters. Along the walls, benches held sleeping furs. At night, families lay together in the dim glow of embers, while livestock shifted in pens nearby. Here, the rhythm of life unfolded. Women spun wool, baked bread on flat stones, and brewed ale. Men repaired tools, sharpened blades, and carved wood. Children played with bone toys in the dust, imitating the work of their elders. Everyday sounds filled the air, the grinding of quernstones, the clatter of pots, the lowing of cattle, the hiss of wet logs in the fire. It was a life of labor, but it was steady, secure, and rooted in the soil. The spread of kingdoms. By the late 5th and early 6th centuries, Saxon settlements were no longer isolated villages. They began to group under stronger leaders, forming the first recognizable kingdoms. In the southeast, Kent emerged, likely founded by the Jutes who'd crossed from modern Denmark. Its rulers, like King Ethelbert in later generations, would wield influence far beyond their borders. To the South Saxons gave their name to Sussex.
To the west, the West Saxons established Wessex, whose dynasty would one day produce Alfred the Great. East Anglia grew from the flat farmlands of the Angles, while in the Midlands, Mercia began to take shape. These kingdoms were fluid at first. Borders shifted with every raid, alliance, and battle. A king might rule only a few dozen villages, yet his name carried weight, his warband feared by neighbors. The role of war. War was central to Saxon life. A king proved his worth not by speeches or laws, but by victory. When the war band assembled, warriors gathered with spears, shields, and seaxes, the short, single-edged blades that became their signature weapon. Battles were brutal, fought in shield walls, where men pressed close, shields overlapping, spears thrusting over the top. Victory brought plunder, slaves, and land. Defeat meant ruin. Yet war was also ritualized. Kings and thanes were bound by a warrior code, a sense of loyalty that demanded courage and despised cowardice. To abandon one's lord in battle was the greatest shame. The bond between lord and warrior was sealed not in parchment charters, but in blood and shared hardship. Poetry and memory. It was in this world that the first echoes of Anglo-Saxon poetry were sung. Around the fire, bards known as scopes recited tales of warriors and their deeds. In later centuries, these would give rise to epic poems like Beowulf. But even in these early days, oral tradition carried memory. The stope's voice was more than entertainment. It was the glue of culture, reminding warriors of their duty, linking them to ancestors, and setting their struggles within a larger frame of meaning. Fragments of such poems survive, telling of exile, loss, loyalty, and fate. Their tone is often melancholy, aware of the fleeting nature of life, a mood fitting for an age where kingdoms rose and fell quickly. The Britons' world shrank. As Saxon kingdoms expanded, the Britons were pushed westward. Yet in Wales, Cornwall, and the north, they endured. Their kings, their bards, and their churches held on to a Romanized identity, contrasting sharply with the pagan newcomers. The frontier between Saxon and Briton was not only military, but cultural. Britons clung to Christianity, while Saxons still worshipped gods like Woden, Thunor, and Tio. Where a Saxon might raise a wooden idol in a grove, a Briton might kneel in a stone church built upon Roman foundations. The clash between these worlds defined the Dark Ages in Britain. So Britain, once a province of Rome, now became a patchwork of small kingdoms, each with its own warlord, each fighting for survival and supremacy. The land was scarred by raids and battles, but also filled with the quiet rhythms of farm life, the warmth of hearths, and the telling of stories. And yet, as these pagan kingdoms grew, one question loomed. How would Christianity return to a land now ruled by Saxons who worshipped the old gods?
When Rome abandoned Britain, so too did much of its Christian order. Churches fell into ruin, bishops vanished, and many communities reverted to older native beliefs. Yet Christianity did not die. It lingered in the West, in Wales, in Ireland, and in the far reaches of Scotland. There, monks kept the flame alive, copying scriptures, chanting psalms, and keeping the memory of the faith that had once united Rome. For the Saxons, newly arrived, Christianity was alien. Their gods were rooted in sky, storm, and battle. Woden was chief among them, a god of wisdom and war. Thunor, with his hammer, ruled thunder. Tu, stern and just, embodied honor in battle. To the Saxon, these gods were woven into every part of daily life, from the harvest to the oath of loyalty. But change was stirring. The old gods, powerful as they seemed, could not hold back the tide forever. Gregory's dream. In Rome, far away from the muddy fields of Britain, a story was told of how Christianity's return began. Pope Gregory the Great, it was said, once saw fair-haired children being sold in a Roman marketplace. He asked who they were, and was told they were Angles from Britain. "They are not Angles," he replied softly. "They are angels." This moment, whether legend or truth, sparked his determination. The pagan Saxons of Britain must be brought to the Christian fold. And so in the year 597 he sent a missionary, Augustine, a monk of the Benedictine order. Augustine arrives. Augustine's journey was uncertain. He and his companions feared the fierce pagan kings they would face, and more than once they considered turning back. But obedience carried them forward, across the Channel to the shores of Kent. Kent was no random choice. Its king, Ethelbert, had married a Frankish princess named Bertha, a Christian. In her new home, Bertha had been allowed to keep a small stone church dedicated to St. Martin, standing near Canterbury. Through her influence, the door was already ajar for Augustine's mission. When Augustine arrived, Ethelbert received him in the open air, wary of magic. The king listened carefully as the monk spoke of Christ, of salvation, and of a kingdom not of this world. Ethelbert did not convert immediately, but he allowed Augustine to preach freely. Soon, a new Christian community took root in Kent. The first conversions. By Christmas of 597, thousands of Kentish people had been baptized in the River Swale. Ethelbert himself accepted baptism not long after, though he did not force his subjects to follow. Instead, he encouraged them gently, offering the new faith as a choice rather than an edict. Canterbury became the centre of this mission. Augustine established his seat there, making it the heart of English Christianity, a role it still holds today. Yet, beyond Kent, the Saxon world remained firmly pagan. The work of conversion would take centuries, carried forward by missionaries, monks, and kings who balanced power with belief. Pagan resilience. For many Saxons, the old gods remained essential. They gave strength in war, fertility in harvest, and courage in oaths. Sacred groves, wooden idols, and seasonal rites bound communities together. Christianity, with its stone churches and Latin prayers, seemed foreign. In some villages, people accepted baptism but still clung to old customs. A man might kneel at church on Sunday and sacrifice at a sacred tree the next day. For generations, paganism and Christianity coexisted, blending in ways that confused and enriched both traditions. Monks of the North. While Augustine worked in the south, another stream of Christianity was flowing from the north. Irish monks, heirs of a fierce and ascetic tradition, travelled across Scotland and Northumbria. At places like Iona, Lindisfarne and Whitby, they built monasteries of stone and wood set against the harsh beauty of the sea. Their monks lived simply. Their robes were coarse, their beds hard, their diet plain. Yet their devotion was intense. They copied sacred texts at candlelight, painted intricate designs in illuminated manuscripts, and ventured into wild lands to preach. Their influence was strong in the north, where the kings of Northumbria began to waver between paganism and Christianity. The Battle of Faiths. By the 7th century, the island was divided not only by rival kingdoms, but by rival Christian traditions. Augustine's Roman mission and the Irish monastic mission clashed over practices: how to calculate Easter, how monks should cut their hair, and who held ultimate authority. This tension came to a head at the Synod of Whitby in 664. There, King Oswiu of Northumbria heard both sides and made his choice. He sided with Rome, aligning the English Church with continental Europe. From that point on, the Roman form of Christianity grew stronger, though the Irish legacy remained in art, learning, and devotion. So the Dark Age world was changing. Pagan kings still rode to war with the names of Woden and Thunor on their lips, but monks were building churches, baptizing children, and copying gospels by candlelight. Britain was no longer only a land of spears and farms, it was becoming a land of faith and scripture. And yet, this Christian dawn raised a new question. Would faith unite the warring kingdoms of Britain, or simply become another tool in the endless struggle for power?
For the kings of early medieval Britain, power was always fragile. A ruler's strength rested on the loyalty of his warband, the fertility of his fields, and his ability to defend borders against rivals. Yet, with the spread of Christianity, another source of legitimacy emerged, the blessing of the Church. A king who allied himself with Christianity did more than embrace a new god. He gained literate priests who could record laws, monks who could preserve memory, and the aura of divine sanction. A crown placed by a bishop was more than metal. It was a sign that the ruler's power was endorsed by heaven. But the relationship was not one-sided. Kings expected the church to support their rule, while bishops relied on royal protection. This delicate balance often brought harmony, but sometimes tension. Edwin of Northumbria. Among the first great Christian kings was Edwin of Northumbria. His reign, in the early 7th century, transformed the north into a powerful realm. At first, a pagan, Edwin was persuaded by missionaries from Kent and his own Christian queen, Aethelberh. A famous council was held to decide whether Northumbria should embrace the new faith. Bede, the historian, records how one of Edwin's advisors gave a striking image. "The life of man on earth, O king, is like a sparrow flying through a hall on a winter's night. For a brief moment, it passes from storm and snow into the warmth and light of the fire, only to vanish again into the cold. So is our life, brief, uncertain, full of darkness. If this new teaching offers greater certainty, it is worthy of acceptance." Moved by such reasoning, Edwin converted, and with him much of his kingdom. Stone churches were built, bishops appointed, and the cross rose beside the banner of kingship. The sword returns. Yet Christianity could not protect a king from the sword. Edwin was slain in battle at Hatfield Chase in 633, his new faith shaken by defeat. For a time, paganism surged back in the north as rivals sought to undo what the missionaries had built. It was only under later rulers, like Oswald, that Christianity was restored. Oswald himself was a warrior king, but also deeply pious, influenced by Irish monks from Iona. He fought with a wooden cross planted in the earth before battle, praying for victory as his men clashed with their enemies. Thus, in Britain, the cross and the sword became entwined. Faith was not only about the soul, it was also about the shield wall. The building of churches. As kings adopted Christianity, so too did the landscape change. Where once sacred groves had stood, now churches of timber and stone rose. Monasteries became centers of not only worship, but also learning and economy. At Wearmouth and Jarrow, monks built libraries filled with Latin manuscripts. At Lindisfarne, they illuminated gospels with delicate patterns of color and knotwork. At Canterbury, Roman influence spread laws, calendars, and new forms of organization. These were not only holy places, but hubs of wealth and influence. Fields were plowed, sheep tended, and barns filled to support the cloisters. The church became a landholder, a political player, and sometimes a rival to kings themselves. The cross and politics. By the later 7th century, Christianity was no longer a fragile newcomer. It was embedded in law, ritual, and authority.
A king who turned away from the church risked being seen as illegitimate. And yet, kings also sought to use the church for their own ends. A generous ruler might grant land to a monastery, winning both the prayers of monks and the loyalty of local people. A shrewd king might place a trusted kinsman as bishop, ensuring the church's voice echoed his own. A devout queen might act as patron, weaving dynastic alliances through religion as well as marriage. The faith was sincere for many, but also political. Struggles within. Yet beneath the surface, tensions remained. The pagan past was not easily erased. Charms, amulets, and folk rituals survived in villages. Old festivals were quietly reshaped into Christian holy days. For some, the gods of the old world still whispered in the shadows. Even among Christians, disputes simmered. How strictly should monks live? Should kings bow fully to bishops, or bishops to kings? And how far should faith justify war? The Dark Ages were not yet an age of certainty. They were an age of negotiation between belief and survival, heaven and earth, the cross and the sword. By the end of the 7th century, Britain's rulers were no longer purely pagan warlords. They were Christian kings, crowned with oil, blessed with relics, and guarded by priests who wrote of their reigns. But kingship remained perilous. A single defeat could undo years of conversion. The cross offered a vision of eternal order. The sword reminded all that life was still brutal and brief. And so we must ask, did Christianity truly bring peace to the Dark Age kingdoms, or did it simply give their wars a new language?
History often remembers crowns and crosses, the sweep of armies, and the intrigues of kings. Yet beneath these dramas, another history persisted, quieter, steadier, and more enduring. This was the history of daily survival, the work of fields, the tending of animals, the weaving of cloth, and the raising of children. For every Edwin or Oswald, there were thousands of men and women whose names are lost to parchment, yet whose hands sowed the wheat and ground the grain that sustained kingdoms. Their world, though rarely recorded, formed the foundation on which the so-called Dark Ages rested. Let us enter their lives, not as heroes of war, but as people of soil, smoke, and silence. The village landscape. A typical settlement in 6th or 7th century Britain was small, scattered, and simple. Stone towns of Roman Britain had crumbled. Villas lay roofless, their mosaics buried beneath weeds. Instead, people clustered into villages of timber halls, thatched roofs, and rough paths of earth. The land was often divided into clearings surrounded by thick woodland. Beyond lay common pastures, scrub, and wild places. Each family tended strips of farmland, long, narrow plots carved from the soil. These strips were scattered, forcing cooperation. A man's wheat might lie beside his neighbor's barley, and neither could harvest without thought for the other. Fields were not fenced as today. Instead, communities relied on shared rules, enforced by custom more than written law. The village was both fragile and resilient, bound by the need to survive winters together. The seasons of labor. Life was ruled by the cycle of seasons. In spring, plowing and sowing consumed every waking hour. Wooden plows, often pulled by oxen, scratched shallow furrows into the earth. Seed was scattered by hand, a hopeful act, for famine was always near. In summer brought weeding, haymaking, and tending to animals. Sheep grazed on higher ground, while pigs roamed woodland, fattening on acorns. Bees were kept for honey and wax, precious resources in a world without sugar or abundant light. Autumn was the season of harvest. Men and women together swung sickles through the golden crop. Grain was dried, threshed, and stored in simple pits or granaries. A failed harvest could mean hunger, not just for one family, but for the whole village. Food and drink. The diet of Dark Age Britain was plain but sustaining. Bread, coarse and heavy, was the staple. Made from wheat or rye, it was baked in clay ovens or on heated stones. Porridge of oats or barley was common, eaten morning and night. Meat was rarer, a luxury reserved for feasts or times of slaughter. Pork was the most common, though cattle provided both milk and occasional beef. Poultry supplied eggs more often than flesh. Fish, fresh or smoked, filled gaps, especially in coastal regions. Ale was the common drink, brewed week and consumed daily, even by children. Water was not always trusted, especially near settlements, and ale provided a safer, nourishing option. Mead, made from honey, was rarer, a drink of celebration, passed in cups at great feasts. For most, meals were eaten from wooden bowls, with knives as the only utensil. Fingers were the rest. The fire, smoky and central, warmed both food and family. Homes and hearths. The typical home was modest, a timber frame, wattle and daub walls, and a roof of thatch. Smoke from the central fire escaped through a hole in the roof or lingered in the rafters. Inside, light was dim, smells heavy, and warmth uneven. Furnishings were simple. Wooden benches, chests, and low stools filled the space. Beds were piled with straw, covered in woolen blankets. A loom stood in many homes, for weaving was the labor of every household. Clothing, whether of linen or wool, was homespun, patched, and mended. Animals often shared the hall, especially in winter. Chickens roosted near the fire, pigs roamed woodland, cattle stood in byres attached to the house. The closeness of beasts and people was not merely practical, it was survival. The role of women. Women's work was constant, vital, and unrecorded. They ground grain on heavy querns, kneeling for hours to produce flour. They spun wool, wove cloth, brewed ale, tended gardens, and raised children. They were healers, too, using herbs passed down through memory. Yarrow for wounds, nettles for strength, chamomile for rest. In times of war, women kept farms alive when men marched away. In times of peace, they bore the burden of continuity, the invisible work that ensured survival from one season to the next. Marriage was both a personal bond and an alliance of families. Dowries, gifts, and kinship ties shaped unions as much as affection. Widowhood was common, childbirth dangerous, and lives often short. Yet women's resilience carried communities across generations. Children and age. Childhood was brief. From as young as 7, children herded geese, fetched water, gathered firewood, and learned the trades of their parents. Play existed, simple games with bones, carved wooden toys, or chasing across fields. But work soon pressed in. Few lived to old age. Disease, poor diet, and accident claimed many. Those who grew gray were respected as keepers of memory, storytellers who linked present to past. Their words guided decisions, their tales gave meaning, and their presence reminded all of life's fragility. Faith in the village. While kings debated councils and monks copied texts, the faith of common folk was simpler. Christianity spread slowly, often layered over older beliefs. A village might honor saints at the church, yet still whisper charms against sickness or tie ribbons to sacred trees. Baptism, burial, and blessings brought the new religion into rhythm with life's stages. But the old gods lingered, in stories told by fireside, in festivals of midsummer, in fears of spirits haunting dark woods. The sacred and the ordinary intertwined, with little concern for strict doctrine. Hidden dangers. Daily life carried constant threats. Famine loomed with every poor harvest. Disease swept silently, with fevers, pox, and unknown ailments taking young and old alike. Accidents with tools or animals could cripple or kill, with little aid beyond herbs and hope. Raiders, too, haunted the imagination. Neighboring villages, rival kingdoms, or sea-borne invaders might descend without warning. A hall could burn in moments, lives uprooted in a night. Thus, vigilance was part of life, even as hope for peace endured. The slow rhythms of survival. Despite hardship, life carried moments of joy. Festivals marked the year, harvest feasts, winter gatherings, weddings and births. Music, played on harps or pipes, lifted spirits. Stories of heroes and ancestors were recited, weaving identity across generations. Communal labor, though wearying, also bound people together. Neighbors joined to raise a roof, harvest a field, or defend a boundary. In this way, the village was more than scattered huts. It was a shared effort, stitched by need, memory, and belief. So passed the days of ordinary people in Dark Age Britain. Their lives were not grand, yet they were essential. Without their toil, kings would starve, bishops would falter, and armies would wither. They were the forgotten multitude, nameless, yet enduring. And we must pause here with a thought. In a world of fragile survival, did people truly believe their daily labor built towards a greater future, or did they simply endure for the present moment?
Imagine a society with no written codes, no courts of stone, no prisons filled with locks and chains. In much of Dark Age Britain, justice was not enforced by the crown or the church alone, but lived within memory, custom, and kinship. There were kings, to be sure, and some issued law codes written in Latin or Old English. Athelbert of Kent, for example, recorded fines for injuries as early as the 7th century. Yet these parchments were rare, and most villagers never saw such texts. Instead, law was remembered in words, passed from elder to younger, recited aloud at gatherings, and enforced by community expectation. Law was less about crime and punishment than about balance, maintaining peace within fragile groups. A wound, a theft, even a killing could not be erased, but it could be compensated. Central to Dark Age law was the concept of the Wehrgild, literally the man price. Every life carried a value, measured not in morality, but in silver or cattle. A freeman, a noble, a thrall, each had a different price. If one man slew another, the kin of the slain could demand vengeance. Yet vengeance risked spirals of blood feud, entire families caught in cycles of killing. To prevent this, custom allowed for compensation, the Wehrgild. Payment might be made in coin, in livestock, or in goods. It was not justice in the modern sense, but it restored balance, soothed anger, and allowed communities to endure. Refusal to pay or refusal to accept was dangerous. Then feud might follow, and the fragile peace of a village could be shattered overnight. In this world, you were never alone. You were always part of a kin group, extended family stretching across generations. Kinship was both shield and chain.
Your kin defended you, provided vergild if needed, and stood beside you at disputes. But they also shared in your shame and your debt. A reckless act by one man could weigh upon dozens of relatives. Marriage expanded kinship ties, binding villages together. Fosterage, raising the child of another family, deepened bonds further. These connections were not sentimental alone, they were survival. To be without kin or to be cast out from them was among the harshest fates. Law and kinship rested upon honor. Honor was not simply pride, but the currency of trust. A man's word, his reliability in oaths, his willingness to defend kin, and his generosity at feasts all shaped his standing. Honor could be fragile. Cowardice in battle, failure to protect family, or breaking an oath might mark a man for life. Conversely, acts of generosity, sharing food in famine, ransoming captives, or giving gifts at gatherings could raise his reputation high. Women, too, carried honor, though measured differently. Chastity, loyalty, and skill in managing households formed their virtue in the eyes of society. Yet their influence was not small. Through marriage alliances, dowries, and quiet persuasion, women shaped the fortunes of families. Disputes, whether over land, theft, or injury, were settled in gatherings known as moots. These were not courts in the modern sense, but assemblies of free men, presided over by elders or local lords. At the moot, oaths were sworn, witnesses heard, and decisions made. Truth was not always established by evidence alone. Oaths, often sworn on relics or crosses or by multiple supporters, held great weight. To swear falsely was to endanger one's soul and kin. Punishments were seldom physical in the brutal sense. Instead, they were social: fines, compensation, or exile. Prison as an institution was almost unknown. A man either lived among his kin, under the watch of community, or he was cast out to wander, a fate many feared more than death. The role of oaths. Oaths were sacred, binding, and feared. To swear falsely risked not only dishonor, but divine wrath. A man who broke an oath might be struck with misfortune, illness, or loss, for the gods, or later the Christian God, were believed to watch closely. In Christianized regions, oaths were sworn on relics or crosses. In older traditions, sacred stones or natural places carried weight. Oath-taking ceremonies were solemn, communal, and memorable. The spoken word held the force of law. In a world with little coinage and no banks, wealth circulated through gifts. Lords gave rings, weapons, and feasts to their followers. Villagers gave food and drink to travelers. Kin exchanged dowries and bride prices. Hospitality was more than kindness. It was a duty, a mark of status. To welcome a stranger, offer bread and grant shelter was both honorable and prudent. For tomorrow, the roles might reverse. You might be the wanderer in need. Feasts marked more than celebration. They reinforced ties. Sitting beside a lord, drinking ale from his hall, confirmed loyalty. Therefore, gift-giving was never free. It bound giver and receiver in webs of obligation, weaving communities together. Yet not all could remain within the circle of law. Those who broke bonds beyond repair, who refused wordgild, who killed treacherously, who betrayed oaths, might be declared outlaws. To be outlawed was to be stripped of kin and community. No man might shelter you, no woman marry you, no kin pay your debts. You were beyond protection, left to wander woods and wastes. Stories of outlaws echo through Old English poetry and later Norse sagas. Some became feared raiders, others pitied beggars. But all reminded communities of the fragile fabric of belonging. With Christianity's spread, law took on new dimensions. Bishops advised kings, monasteries preserved texts, and sin was spoken of alongside crime. To steal was not only to wrong your neighbor, but to endanger your soul. Yet older customs lingered. Even Christian law codes often retained weregild, kinship obligations, and oaths by relics. The fusion of sacred and secular shaped the unique texture of Dark Age justice. Honor extended into war. Battles were not only contests of power, but tests of loyalty. Warriors fought beside their lords, bound by oaths of service. To abandon one's lord in battle was among the gravest shames. Death in loyalty, however, was honored. Songs remembered those who fell beside their lords, even when defeat was certain. Such loyalty reinforced the hierarchy of society. Lords depended on followers, followers depended on lords, and kinship extended into the shield wall itself. Trust was the invisible thread of Dark Age life. Without it, kin could not share land, neighbors could not farm side by side, and strangers could not pass safely from one hall to another. Trust was slow to build and quick to break. A feud could divide villages for generations. A single false oath might ruin a man's standing forever. Yet trust was also what allowed peace, trade, and survival in a world where written contracts were rare. Thus, we glimpse how law, kinship, and honor bound Dark Age communities together. Their world was fragile. One bad harvest, one rash feud, one broken oath, and the balance could collapse. Yet through memory, custom, and belief, people held together across centuries of uncertainty. And so we pause with a question. In a society so dependent on fragile ties, was peace ever more than temporary, or was it always a pause between conflicts?
As the 7th and 8th centuries unfolded, Britain's fractured landscape began to weave itself into larger webs of power. At the heart of this transformation stood the Lord, not always a king, sometimes merely the master of a hall and a few villages, but a figure of authority nonetheless. The Lord's hall was the center of his power. Built of timber, with smoke-stained rafters and walls hung with shields, the hall was more than a dwelling. It was a stage. Here oaths were sworn, disputes judged, and feasts held. The Lord sat in the high seat, distributing food, drink, and gifts. His generosity affirmed his status, while his followers, seated along the benches, confirmed their loyalty in return. This relationship between Lord and follower was not abstract. It was practical, woven through daily acts of giving and receiving. A Lord offered protection, food, and prestige. A follower, in turn, offered service, whether in battle, in council, or in the maintenance of the Lord's household. The hall echoed with songs of loyalty, but also with the practical clatter of survival. Pots boiling over the fire, cattle driven in at dusk, armor repaired by lamplight. Power was intimate, face to face, reliant upon constant performance of generosity and loyalty. Monasteries as islands of light. While lords ruled through halls, another kind of power emerged in stone and parchment, the monastery. The arrival of Christianity had brought not only new beliefs, but new ways of organizing life. Monasteries were not merely religious retreats. They were farms, libraries, schools, and centers of diplomacy. Monks copied manuscripts, preserving the fragile memory of the ancient world. They tilled fields, bred livestock, and cared for the poor. Some monasteries were modest wooden enclosures. Others, like Lindisfarne or Iona, shone as beacons of devotion. Their churches, though simple by later standards, offered a sense of permanence rare in a timber world. The monks' rhythm of prayer divided the day into hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sixt, none, vespers, and compline. In this measured life,
Time itself seemed more ordered than in the fields and villages beyond. While peasants labored by the rising and setting of the sun, monks followed the tolling of bells and the chanting of psalms. In monasteries, the quill and parchment created a new form of authority. Laws, gospels, saints' lives, all were set down in writing. What had once been memory and custom could now be fixed, preserved, and spread. To write was to claim permanence. A king whose deeds were recorded might outlast the forgetting of generations. A saint whose miracles were written might inspire distant lands. In this sense, the monastery was a forge of memory, a place where the fleeting became lasting. Yet parchment was scarce, ink costly, and literacy rare. Most people never read a word in their lives. Still, the sound of Latin prayers, the sight of illuminated manuscripts, and the presence of holy men gave monasteries an aura of otherworldly power. From halls and monasteries alike, larger kingships began to grow. Small lordships gave way to regional kingdoms, and sometimes, for a fleeting moment, a single ruler might claim dominance across much of Britain. Bede, the 8th century monk of Jarrow, spoke of Bretwaldas, overlords who held sway over other kings. Their power was never permanent, always contested, but the dream of unity haunted the age. The rise of Mercia under kings like Offa exemplified this. Offa's dyke, a great earthwork stretching for miles along the Welsh border, was both a defensive barrier and a symbol of authority. Such projects required immense labor, suggesting a level of central command previously unknown. Yet even the strongest kings relied on fragile bonds. Loyalty had to be continually earned, gifts continually given, and victories continually proven. One defeat could unravel years of authority. By the late 8th century, a new shadow crept over the land, the longships of the Norse. In 793, the monastery of Lindisfarne was raided, its monks slaughtered, its treasures seized. To contemporaries, it seemed as if the world itself was ending. The Vikings brought not only violence, but disruption. The delicate balance of lords, kinship, and monasteries was shaken. Fortunes were overturned. Some kings fell, others rose by resisting or even cooperating with Norse adventurers. Yet the Viking Age also marks the close of what we might call Britain's lost Dark Ages. For with the Viking incursions, the island was once again drawn into the currents of broader European history. Chronicles grew fuller, records more numerous, kings more centralized. The fog of unrecorded centuries began to lift. As we close this long journey, let us return to the quieter rhythms that outlasted kings and invasions alike. The plough still carved its furrows. The hearth still glowed with embers. Bread was still baked, ale brewed, wool spun. Songs still marked the long nights, and tales were still told of ancestors and heroes. For all the shifts of power, the vast majority of people lived much as their grandparents had. They rose with the dawn, tended their fields, honored their kin, and placed trust in oaths and in God. It is in these details, the worn tools, the patched cloaks, the whispered prayers, that the true continuity of the Dark Ages lies. Reflection. The meaning of the Dark Ages. Why call them dark? Not because the people themselves were without light, but because the written record is thin. To us it is a shadowed age, a time of gaps and silences. Yet in those silences we hear other sounds, the creak of wooden halls, the chanting of monks, the clash of swords, the murmur of markets, and the quiet breath of peasants asleep after long toil. Their world was uncertain, often harsh, but never without meaning. Out of their struggles came the kingdoms, the churches, and the traditions that would shape medieval Britain. As you drift into rest,
Let your mind wander back through those centuries. The farmers walking muddy tracks, the lords feasting in smoky halls, the monks copying words by flickering candlelight, the kin gathered around their hearths, balancing honor with survival.